My name is Kathy Gomez. I'm the Deputy Director at Community Legal Services. First off, this podium is huge. I'm not short. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. This is Community Legal Services and Philadelphia Legal Assistants' second time participating in Philly Tech Week, and we are thrilled to be part of this terrific legal event. It's great that members of our community can get together and talk about issues that vulnerable clients face. As you may know, CLS and PLA provide free legal representation to low-income Philadelphians on very important civil legal issues. Our clients have better outcomes when decision makers have the information they need to fully understand the issues and problems our clients face. So we thank you very much for being here today to hear about issues facing low-wage workers. We're so grateful to Schneider for hosting us today. Not only are they providing a space, but they're also providing a lovely reception afterwards. We're very thankful for their support. I also want to give a shout out to CLS and PLA, folks who have worked very hard on this event. Mike Hollander, Nate Vogel, Seth Lyons, Caitlin Brown, Jonathan Pyle, Julia Simon Michelle, and I'm sure I'm missing others. Thank you very much. Last but not least, I want to thank our excellent panelists for taking time to be here today. None of them are robots, but they are a tremendous panel of experts, nevertheless, and I look forward to learning from them. With that said, I want to turn the program over to our moderator, Tony Abraham.
All right. Hi, folks. Tony Abraham. I'm a reporter for Technically Media. We are a news and events group. We publish Technically, which is tech news, and Generosity, which is social impact news. I report for both of them, which as we kind of square in the middle of what we're going to talk about today, which is low-wage workers, robots, automation, artificial intelligence, and mostly whether or not those robots are taking low-wage workers' jobs, which is up for debate, I suppose. Before we kind of go into this full throttle, I want to kind of just remind everyone it's very easy to, especially if you saw the graphic for this, with an incredible graphic, by the way, with the big robot towering over the city with laser eyes. It's very easy to think of this and think this is something new, but it's not. And there's a good actually, you might have heard of it. It's a story, Charlie the Chocolate Factory. If you'll bear with me for just a moment. Everyone remembers Charlie Bucket and his success story, but we often overlook the success story of his father, who worked at a toothpaste plant and screwed on the caps of the toothpaste tubes, and then lost his job. And then, well, actually he lost it to a robot on an assembly line. Then he got his job back, but instead of putting caps on the toothpaste, he got a job preparing the robot that took his job. So we're going to talk about that today, just what that looks like in the 21st century. If there is anything that looks like that in the 21st century, what we're doing to prepare the low-wage workers for the 21st century. And with that, let's introduce our first speaker, Michelle Johnson. She's an assistant professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation at the University of Pennsylvania.
So thank you first of all for having me to be able to present. And I titled my talk Glass Half Full, that glass half full take on robots. The caveat is, and my bias is that I am a roboticist. And so essentially that's what I do for a living. And my lab is focused on rehabilitation robots and the idea of looking at technology to bridge the gap in the healthcare industry and in the medical industry, and especially focused on people with disabilities that they are a category of low-wage workers, because oftentimes, because of disability, they have been pushed out of the market and unable to get back to the job that they had, and so they're often a category of low-wage workers. So I wanted to kind of be a little bit provocative and kind of put a couple of different images in your head so that to kind of motivate my talk. So maybe I should put on the presentation mode. So this is often the image that we see of robots that I think then terrify people and like, oh no, they're taking our jobs. Now I think that's partially true on some level. The idea is that by 2019, more than 1.4 million new industrial robots will be placed and installed in factories around the world. So on some level, the factory of the 21st, 22nd, and future is going to look different. It's going to look like this. The other view, however, is, preempting, but one of the challenges with the robots that look like this is that they're often not safe to be used around people. So the glass half full part of it is thinking about designing and producing robots that can be symbiotic, that can work alongside people. That's kind of my push. I am not in the business of replacing healthcare workers. I recognize a shortage in healthcare workers, and I'm in the business of creating robots that can come alongside and work with healthcare workers to make them more productive. So the key thing for the factory of the future is, in the past, in terms of the technology development, these robots were probably primary. The new evolution of robots, like I have a picture of a robot called Baxter, is robots that are safer and more friendlier and able to work alongside people in the factories of the future. So I think that's the glass half full. So hopefully there will be a segment where we won't be displacing fully manufacturing jobs or assembly line jobs, but we'll be producing robots that can work alongside. The other image that often is seen, and this is actually a colleague of mine's robot called Saviok. They're from LA, and they're building a line of service robots. So in robotics, we talk about the industrial robots, which is the picture we just saw, and then there's another group of robots that are coming at us very fast, is service robots. But those robots could be in medicine, they could be in work, in the general work environment, in defense, in logistics, in the field, and those robots are sometimes protective as well. In this case, the Saviok robot is functioning as a waiter and delivering. So in some sense, you're saying, okay, well, it's possibly taking over that job of the person who would come and bring the food to your door. On the other side, the other type of service robots that are robots that go out and survey and look for mines and go into dangerous places are protective robots. So I'm here to advocate for the both sides. And in that, I want to be able to say that, yes, while there's some downsides, I also think that there are upsides. Here's just another image of a medical robot that is delivering food to patients in the environment. These robots, I would say, oftentimes, when I talk to service users or sometimes people in low-wage jobs that maybe they were employed to deliver the food, they would say they didn't mind. Many of them didn't mind the presence of the robot because, for example, going up and down those elevators, and they'd rather spend time in the cafeteria preparing the food, servicing the robot, and sending the robot along the way. So the labor-intensive part that the robot takes away from the person is often welcome. And I think as long as the robot and the person can be somewhat symbiotic, I think it often is a good thing. The fear I hear is, well, it's gonna, at some point, they're not gonna need me. And I think my other colleagues on the panel will probably speak more to that. And I would say as technology evolve and as the jobs that robots take on evolve, then I think the jobs that we do will also have to evolve. This is the Baxter robot, and it was developed by a professor at MIT, and it's an industrial robot with a different paradigm. It's the one where it's developed to be human-friendly and able to actually work very closely with the human factory worker. This was an image of some newfangled robots in Japan. So I think in certain markets, what we'll find is when there's shortage of workers and potential people to take care of the aging population, the idea of robotics become even more appealing because the bottom line is there may not be anyone to do these types of work. I always like to put this image up. This is an image that I talk about a lot. On one side are healthcare, because this is the field that I'm particularly involved in, are the healthcare workers. And, not very far, 2030, there will be growing numbers of people with disabilities. It's projected now that by, I think in 2010, there were about 60 million people, 20% of the American population that had some disabilities. By 2030, this population is going to be growing to almost a third, somewhere about 25 to a 3rd% of the population. So in those terms, many people will move into this low-wage working category. And then the question is, can technology bridge that gap? One, help healthcare workers service people who are going to be newly disabled, and then 2, help people that are newly disabled become functional again in the market in some way. Here's an example. These are Da Vinci robots that are in the medical area to improve productivity in surgery. There's also robots that are kind of being used to allow for medical service and telemedicine and actually healthcare to occur in remote locations. So there are robots in this area that are actually working alongside and increasing our productivity. This is the image I love to show. It's of these 2 robots that are helping 2 people with high-level spinal cord injury pour a beer, okay? And I love this image because it seems like such a simple thing for us who are able to pour our own beer, but the ability for these 2 gentlemen that don't have use of their arm to participate is one of the benefits that robots can bring. And this is another rehab image of a healthcare worker working with a stroke survivor to help do exercises. And what these robots are trying to do is do the heavy lifting. What we find out is in healthcare, oftentimes you need more time on task and more exercise and more hours in order to recover. So if you can set someone on the robot and they can do 1,000 repetitions of an exercise while the therapist do something else, that's a good use of the person. And it wouldn't be a good use of a physical therapy assistant or someone even lower, because imagine someone moving that person's arm 1,000 times. That's actually one of injury results. There's a lot of injury for these types of hard lifting type jobs that I think robots can save us from. This is an article that I was reading as I was doing a little bit of homework. It says, don't fear the robots, tech creates jobs. And so the idea here was that growth of jobs in the creative care and tech and business services, do in the short run or take some jobs, and I agree, because you don't have as, when you think about automation and agriculture, there's not that many, farmers now when most of us used to be farmers. But because of that automation and the Industrial Revolution, new jobs are being created and new productivity, new wealth. So I think I like the glass half full version. And my last slide is this another image that came out of another article that talks about thinking about how robots might kind of function in the future, and thinking about existing jobs on the top, jobs that humans do and jobs that maybe machines could do. The idea is there are jobs that humans do that we actually will, if we're honest, machines could do better. Like things that are hard labor that might hurt your back, that might require lifting 100 pounds or 10 to 50 pounds and walking long ways. If you could have a machine helper, that's a good thing. However, there are jobs that we currently do that robots can't do. And that's the part in my work, is to try to separate that out and to add value to the therapist and the medical person while taking away the parts of the job that the machine can support and help out in. So I'm going to say one last thing, and in the terms of new jobs, I think in the future, and I agree with this article, we can't even imagine some of the jobs that will be created as a result of new technology and robots. So as I said when I prefaced my presentation, it's the glass half full. And in terms of look at this type of issue, while acknowledging that low wage, there's a tension here, I do think that there's opportunity to actually even promote some low wage workers, such as people with disabilities, into the marketplace because of these types of systems. I'll stop there and let my next colleague go.
My name is Larry Michelle. Hi, my name is Larry Michelle. I'm the president of the Economic Policy Institute. That's over right here. Tweet at me at Larry Michelle. I'm very honored to be on a panel of two great organizations, Philadelphia Legal Assistance and Community Legal Services. I'm equally honored just to be in my hometown of Philadelphia and Philly Tech Week. I'm going to start off with just a summary of my basic argument, and I'm going to go flesh it out. So this is about robots. And when I'm talking about robots, I'm really talking about automation. It's the process of capital replacing machines doing things that people used to do. It's not about technological change, which is a very big subject. It's about machines replacing people. And my bottom line is that the discussion of robots is frequently a distraction, in my view, from the main issues that confront America. I think the main issues that confront us are decades-long erosion of good jobs and wage stagnation and inequality. And this is a discussion about some potential crisis 20 years from now that we are asking to occupy our time right now when we actually are living in a crisis. The issues about robots are whether we're going to not have enough jobs in the future, and whether it's going to cause inequality, and whether robots or automation has done that in the past. It's clear, everyone knows, automation has eliminated specific jobs. You know, we took elevators up here, there's nobody running the elevator. You know, there's fewer secretaries, etc. Automation has been eliminating jobs in specific occupations and industries for more than a century. So, and any, you know, and people who were affected by that deserve lots of help and our attention. But similarly, I want to make sure everyone also accepts that there's no basis for any claim that automation in the past has led to any overall increase in joblessness or unemployment. And I'll explain why that in fact has happened, right? There's been a lot of automation. We have not seen elevated joblessness increasing for the last 150 years. Similarly, I don't think there's any basis for believing that technological change or automation has led to the wage stagnation we have faced or the wage inequality and I'll explain that. Especially because there's not even possible that automation has had any effect on wage stagnation or inequality in the years since 1999, because all the prima facie evidence for that is absent, and I'll explain that. Moreover, any sense that there's a big upsurge in automation is not true. Looking over the last 10 years, you cannot find the footprint of any upsurge in automation. There may be a lot of articles in tech magazines and on the web about it, a lot of hubbub in the Washington Post, New York Times, and Philadelphia Inquirer, but it's not there. In terms of the future, most of everything is just pure speculation about how many jobs can potentially be automated without reference to exactly when that's going to happen, how fast, nor does it take into account the two offsetting things that a prior speaker says. Robots can take away jobs, but there are other mechanisms, which I'll explain, that at the same time will lead to an increase in jobs, right? So most of the talk about the future is frankly this. Look, robots, wow! No jobs. And not one iota more substance than that. I'm serious, I read a lot of this stuff, I watch TED Talks, suffered from TED Talks, etc. There's no claim for technology or robots going to lead to inequality. And moreover, what I've realized over the last 2 months is that those who are telling us to worry about robots in the future are trying to tell us that to get ready for that, we have to be focused on education and training. Maybe there's basic income, we can set that aside, but a lot of it's education and training. You know, I'm someone, I have spent 40 years focused on, in some of my time on policies with manufacturing. I'm a former economist for the steelworkers and the auto workers union. What has happened to manufacturing workers who got screwed over the last 40 years is not because they were not provided education and training. It's because we didn't have good jobs to move them to. And because we had a period of wage suppression that really made the working class as a whole take stagnant wages or lower wages. So in the future, if we really want to worry about what happens to people who see their jobs automated, it's the same thing that we have to worry about right now. It's creating good jobs, it's reversing the suppression of wage growth, it's getting robust wage growth for everybody. It turns out the solution for robots is a solution we should be addressing right now for anything else, including the work of the two organizations that sponsor this. So, I think I've already said this. So the issue is really, I'm an economist. Did I not say that? And empirically, what are the real issues? It's really, it's a 4x4, it's a 2x2 box. Have robots increased joblessness in the past? Are they going to do so in the future? Have robots increased inequality or wage stagnation in the past? Or are they going to do so in the future? So let me just go over the way I see how to answer these questions. Okay, first, in joblessness. Given the fact that we've had automation and rapid automation for many, many decades, if it really increased overall joblessness, then you would expect the unemployment rate to get higher every decade. We have not seen that. If you thought that there was an upsurge of automation in recent years, you should be surprised that we lowered the unemployment rate from 10% to below 5%. How did that happen? So the fact is that there may be automation, but there are other dynamics at work that preserve the overall jobs. And we should not be fearful that there will not be jobs. We can worry about people that are displaced and what happens to them. But the idea that that technology created joblessness in the past or will in the future, I think is totally unwarranted. So the reason why, when you have automation, that one intuition for this, that the prior speakers said too, is take farms. But I want to talk about the mechanism. So 80% of the people used to work in farms back in the mid 1800s, 19th century. And of course now it's less than 3%. Okay. The fact is that the process is not just that it displaced all these people who would be in farming or were farmers, is that back in 1900, every household would spend, let's say 40% of their budget on food. as you get automation, the food became cheaper. As it became cheaper, instead of spending 40% of your budget on food, you move it down to spending around 25%. The money you were spending on food, that other 15% of your budget, didn't disappear. People spend it on other things that they needed. And that process will go on. The only reason why employers replace workers is to make things more cheaply. When they make things more cheaply, things get cheaper. When things get cheaper, consumers end up with more money. They spend it, unless you think people have run out of things that they want, which I don't think is true. Okay? I don't think that's going to be true. It hasn't been true in the past, and I don't think it's going to be true in the future. So I totally reject, I think, the idea that we will face joblessness in the future on account of automation. And no one has actually made an argument as to why things will be different this time. They mostly just say there's going to be a lot of automation, and they never address the issue of why the mechanisms that help create more jobs in the past, why won't they create more jobs in the future? We can't tell you where the jobs are going to be, because I don't know where people are going to spend their money. But I can tell you not to be fearful that we're not going to have jobs. Getting ahead of myself. So inequality, which is what I spent my career studying. The argument that technology creates inequality is the following. It's usually talked about in terms of occupational employment polarization. The idea is that occupations which, if you rank occupations by wages, from high to low, polarization is described as a situation where occupations expand, the high-wage occupations expand, the middle-wage occupations shrink, and the low-wage occupations expand. So that is said to hurt the middle and shift people to both the bottom and the top, creating inequality. The case that technology has created inequality is about this job polarization, okay? Occupational employment patterns. Now, here's what I'm going to tell you about what's happened since 1999. There has been no polarization. Almost all the jobs we've created have been low wage. There's not a prima facie plausible case that occupational employment patterns can explain wage inequality or wage stagnation. Okay? Secondly, my work with colleagues has shown that these occupational employment patterns are totally uncorrelated with what happens to wages. If an occupation is expanding its employment, doesn't mean that occupation's wage will rise faster than other occupations. Okay? Last, all this occupational employment polarization is itself a distraction from the issue of the top 1%, which doubled its share of income over the last 40 years. It totally does not explain inequality. So just to get lawyerly, if job polarization was the weapon that committed the crime of inequality, my case to you is that since 1999, the weapon wasn't there. If it was there, it didn't even have bullets. And third, if it had bullets, it couldn't even kill the victim because it didn't address the top 1%. Okay? So I don't worry about inequality. Was there a surge in automation? No one knows how to measure technological change. But we know that there are indicators. There's various indicators, but I just want to show you the trends. Labor productivity, and basically these are the time periods. It's long ago to recent. That's all you need to know. Labor productivity has been, in fact, very, very slow in the most recent period. Capital investment per worker, very slow relative to prior times. The growth of information equipment in the workplace, very slow compared to earlier times. The growth of software investment in the workplace, very slow. It's implausible to me that you could say that there's automation upsurge when everything that should be associated with automation has in fact decelerated. So, last thing I'll do, just quickly, is some related topics, because the robots comes up in discussions about the future of work and the nature of work. I just want to point out a few things. Gig economy, freelancers, people keep on saying that we're all becoming freelancers. Gig work is exploding, we're all going to become gig workers. My way of saying, my answer to that is, those things, if you're at a conference on the future of work, those things deserve a workshop, definitely not even a plan. Okay, they're important, but they go alongside other things that we really, really care about. Freelance work, self-employment, BLS does it in two ways. There's everyone who is self-employed, and then this one is people who are self-employed who don't themselves have employees. For some reason, BLS self-employment allows you to have your own employees. So I have, here's the trend. It's been the same for 20 years. The amount of self-employment as a share of total employment has been the same for 20 years. How about other trends? Here's new work, very important work by Larry Katz at Harvard, Alan Kruger at Princeton, which introduces some of the important things about the so-called fissured workplace. Contracting out, on-call work, and things like that. What I want to point out, what we know is that here's all alternative work arrangements grew a lot from 10.7% to 15.8% in that 10-year period. That's a big growth. A lot of it was the growth of independent contractors, but again, which is another word for self-employed, only 8.4%. Other types of alternative work arrangements are this. This is around 7%. And grew from 2005 to 2015. The fact is, there's a growth of this, but this is not everything. This is a workshop, and we need to address it. And gig economy, 0.5% of all employees, according to Alan Kruger, do work through online intermediaries. I think that's actually generous, and I'll just go to the man himself, David Plouffe from Uber, said that they paid in 2015 $4.7 billion of wages. If you take that net of the expenses that the drivers have, in terms of what their real pay is, you can find out that that's 0.06% of all wages for Uber drivers, right? That's less than 1/10 of 1%. If Uber is 2/3 of the gig economy, as Alan Kruger says, then the whole gig economy is about 0.1% of all wages. And the reason why it's a lot smaller in terms of wages than it is in terms of employment is that we know that most Uber drivers, the average Uber driver, or not most, there are many Uber drivers who drive around 10 or 12 hours a week. And there are about half the drivers that are full-time. But on average, it's supplementary work, and there are low wages. So the idea that the gig economy, which represents a statistical error in the national economy, it should occupy as much time as it is in the news. I mean, I think it's a very important labor policy issue because I think most gig workers are actually misclassified. They're actually employees, not self-employed. That's an issue we have to fight about. But the idea that we all have to worry about becoming gig workers in the future is not true. I'm not going to go through these, but I have what really explains inequality and what you do about it. But I'll just say what the bottom line is that it's about power. It's about employers through policy and wealthy people putting in policies that undercut the bargaining power of individual workers and collective bargaining power of workers so that people have to accept jobs which they'd rather not accept, and pay, which is totally unfair, and redistributed a ton of income from the vast majority to the upper 1%. And if we're going to address this, it's not about technology, it's about dealing with the power of corporations and wealthy Americans. Thank you very much. That might have been controversial.
So I'm just going to say, first and foremost, may the 4th be with you. Originally, when I figured out that this panel was happening on May the 4th, I had a plan to do the entire thing in Star Wars memes, but my children talked me out of that. And I also want to start by thanking the organizers of this panel, particularly Community Legal Services, the Philadelphia Legal Assistants, and of course, thank you, for moderating the panel. My name is Katie Sipp, and I'm the managing director of a national immigrant workers' rights organization called the National Guest Worker Alliance. I have been an organizer of workers, mostly low-wage workers, for about 20 years, mostly in traditional unions and some in what's called alt-labor, which are things like worker centers or organizations of the unemployed who are organizing around economic justice issues. I've also always been an early adopter of technology, and I really love technology. And one of the things that I have been sort of curious about in the course of my sort of 25-year career as an organizer is how particularly the labor movement has adopted or failed in many cases to adapt to both the use of technology in organizing, but also to the changing way that technology affects people at work. About 6 years ago, I started getting really, really interested in issues around what Larry calls the future of work, or around the issues that are raised by the ways that employers are changing work for lots of employees. And I started reading and writing about it more, and I started a blog called Hack the Union, which is really, because I am not convinced personally that just simply a return to a high level of collective bargaining is the thing that's going to fix our economic system for everyone, and so that we sort of return to a time when it's more economically fair. And I say that frankly as somebody who's been an officer of a local union and has bargained contracts. We didn't get to a place of less inequality in this country simply through collective bargaining. We got it through a lot of other organizing and other kinds of efforts as well. And I'm going to focus on some of that kind of stuff. But I'm going to go on a little bit of a digression, and I hope you'll bear with me. And Nadia agreed to cede 5 minutes of her time to me. So it was May Day this week, right, which is the International Workers' Holiday, and I came into the Center City for the march on May Day, which was beautiful. Folks weren't there. You should regret it. And then also look at the beautiful pictures that are scattered around online of folks getting together to celebrate their victories at work over the last year. And then I went home and I sat down and I was like, all right, I'm going to think about what I'm going to say on this panel. And one of the things that started running through my mind when I sat down to think about what I was going to think on this, what I was going to say on this panel was a speech that Dr. Martin Luther King gave at the very end of his life called "Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution," which is my favorite speech that Dr. King gave. It's the last Sunday sermon that he preached before he was assassinated. He gave it at the National Cathedral in DC on March 31st, 1968. And in it, he sort of laid out the rationale for a thing called the Poor People's Campaign that he and other leaders of the SCLC were launching that spring. And that continued after his murder. At the beginning of the speech, he talks about why he thinks that we at that time are living through a great revolution. And I'm going to read this quote because I want to get it right. He says, "It's a triple revolution. That is, a technological revolution with the impact of automation and cybernation. There is a revolution in weaponry with the emergence of atomic and nuclear weapons of warfare. Then there is a human rights revolution with the freedom explosion that is taking place all over the world." So I want you to let that sink in for a minute. Because I think that the solutions that King proposes in that speech to these three threats that he identifies as happening are still pretty relevant for us today. And the Poor People's Campaign continued to agitate for them after his death. He talks about how technology made the world a brotherhood, but not, or a neighborhood, but not a brotherhood. And I think that, it's pretty clear to me that here in 2017, we are still reeling from the effects of the fact that we have not built a brotherhood, or in my language, a siblinghood. He talks about how we need to eradicate racial injustice. And in a week where we saw another 15-year-old African-American kid get shot and killed by police, I think we can say that we haven't really effectively ended racial injustice in this country. And he talks about the need about redistribution and about our need to use technology and our scientific intelligence to finally end poverty, not just in the US, but globally. And I think that as we sit today in the poorest big city in the United States of America, that we can also say that we haven't won the war on poverty either. So to go back a little bit, to today's topic, after I took you on that journey, I'm going to take a quick survey. So I'm going to ask folks just to raise your hand if the following statements apply to you. So in the past month, did you order groceries online? Raise your hand. All right. Did you go to a supermarket and buy your groceries at a supermarket in the past month? Lots of folks, but some folks doing the online grocery shopping. All right, in the past month, have you watched a movie in your house on some kind of online streaming, Netflix, Hulu, whatever? Yes? In the past month, did you go to a movie theater and buy popcorn and sit in a place with everybody else? Again, some folks, yes, not everybody, but most people doing the other, what's become more common. In the past month, did you order any food from an app or from an iPad? In the past month, did you go to a restaurant where you had like a physical menu that had different servers and bussers and cooks? Lots of restaurant folks. And then finally, when you went to a new place, or maybe here in this place, in the past month, did you take either a Lyft or an Uber or some other kind of ride-sharing service? And did you go to a new place and rent a car instead? Two holdouts for the car rental. Okay? So, there's nothing wrong with any of these individual choices. They are all completely relevant and, worthwhile. But I think that one of the things that is very different about the new automation that is happening in the 21st century is that it is much more our choices as consumers that are impacting low-wage workers, where, historically it is true that there were lots of commercial decisions that were made, whether that was to bring in, software that replaced secretaries or robots that replaced factory workers that made this job transition happen. But what we are seeing now is that the impact of automation is really hitting service sector workers in new and different ways, and in some ways that's being driven more by consumer choices than it is by employer choices. So I'm not personally that concerned about whether the automation apocalypse hits in 5 years or 15 years or in 50 years. I have kids, so even if it hits in 50 years, where I might be dead, they'll still be alive, hopefully. What I am very concerned about, though, is the fact that we sit in a city that today has a black male unemployment rate of 25%. And that is directly a result of the fact that we didn't solve these social problems related to work that Dr. King was calling out in 1968, almost 50 years ago. So we can't just, sort of lay at the feet of technology the slow erosion of prosperity that has happened for American workers. Obviously, there are lots of other things that have happened to hasten inequality and to take away people's ability to live, sort of full and sustained lives. But we are also not without the technology that both some folks use in their work lives and some of us use just as consumers is also not without culpability, whether that's like macro choices that developers and programmers make or individual choices that we make as consumers. So I want you to think about some stuff, right? If I'm buying my groceries online, what does that mean for the staffing patterns of grocery stores? They are probably going, if they're starting to lose even 5% or 10% of their business to services like Instacart or Peapod or any of those kinds of things, they're going to have fewer jobs. It's not going to be like all these grocery stores shut the next day, but grocery stores are still one of the places where low-wage workers can find decent unionized employment with health care and benefits, and especially pensions. And you know what? Your Instacart driver can't get a pension because, as Larry points out, they're not an employee. They're an independent contractor. So even if the company wanted to provide benefits to them, if they want to sustain the model of employment that they're using, which is 1099 employment, they are not going to take the risk of expanding the benefits pool. So if I'm going to the movies less and not buying my popcorn but making it at home, that's, again, we're not going to see all movie theaters close overnight. People still want to be able to go to the movies and see a movie. But there will be fewer jobs for like teenagers who want to, serve popcorn for a living for their first job. And that is going to eventually, have an impact on teenagers' ability to get entry-level work and then move into the workforce. And we have seen that one of the things that's happened is that teenagers are increasingly competing with, younger adults for entry-level employment because there is just less of it to go around. If I go to Wawa to get my lunch, and I know you are Philadelphians, and therefore you love your Wawa, right? I don't talk to a person. I either go in and I buy a prepackaged salad or like a hoagie that's already wrapped, or I go in and stand there in a line with like 3 other people at iPads ordering my food. And that is to my benefit, because I don't have to stand in line behind those 3 other people while they're talking to the one person whose job it used to be to take all of the orders. But it means that the staffing patterns of the Wawa have changed as well. So, and you can, as you sort of think about, and I would challenge people to, as you are going through your day-to-day life and thinking about, and making some of these consumer choices, I think it leads us to ask some questions. Whose world am I disrupting, right? And if that is a person, if the person whose world that I am disrupting has less power and privilege than I do, what is my responsibility to make sure that that disruption gets offset in a way that drives towards more equality as opposed to less? I think that's a fair question for us to ask ourselves. Whose knowledge or expertise am I benefiting from? And is that person whose knowledge I am benefiting from, are they getting anything out of the fact that I'm benefiting from their knowledge? I think that's a fair question for us to ask. We have used technology in a lot of ways to collectivize knowledge. And it's a beautiful thing that I can pull out my phone and look on Wikipedia and basically answer any question of trivia that I could ever want to know the answer to. Or look up movie times, or do all of the stuff that we used to actually either have to know or look in a book. I mean, it's great. That is a wonderful thing. But we haven't really figured out how to use our technology or our scientific expertise to collectivize equality and justice. And I think that, as I sort of move into the part of my talk that's more about solutions, I want to challenge people to think about that a little bit. So, how are people going to live in a society where more and more work is automated? Whether or not that turns into, everybody has a new, different kind of job that didn't exist 100 years ago, that's certainly going to happen. But what I think we have to sort of think about a little bit is, how are we making these choices as consumers, and what are the choices that we can make that will, as Dr. King said, bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice? So for everyone in this room, I would urge you to think about what you can do on the political front, frankly, to support big transformational ideas, like ending the criminalization of work, allowing open borders for labor, not just capital, or creating portable benefit systems or systems of universal basic income. What I mean when I say ending the criminalization of work is that we should be promoting the idea that people have a right to earn a living regardless of their immigration status. And our city council just last week passed a resolution reaffirming that right. And in doing so, what they talked about was the fact that people who work as undocumented workers are more likely to be subject to wage theft. They are more likely to continue to do work in what they feel are dangerous conditions, and they are more likely to be subjected to other kinds of abuse at work, like whether that's sexual harassment, racial harassment, LGBT discrimination, whatever it is. They are more likely to be affected by those jobs or by those problems if they are working without documentation than people who are working with legal documents. I work for an organization that represents both guest workers and undocumented immigrants. Guest workers being people who have a legal right to work in the U.S. for a time-windowed period of time, but can only stay at one employer. And if they quit that employer, then they have to go back to their home country or face deportation. And our members have arguments about who has the worst situation. Because the guest workers will be like, the undocumented people at least can quit a shitty job, whereas if I'm stuck in the terrible job, I can't quit that job. And the undocumented people are like, yeah, but every time you get stuck, you drive down the street, you're not worrying that you're gonna, your entire family's gonna be split up and you're gonna be sent home with 0 notice. And that's not a great way for either of those groups to live, frankly. it's really great that City Council passed that resolution, and I think it's super necessary for cities and states all across the country to start standing up and saying that this is a policy that we should be for. But it's really Congress that has the power to change that law, and we should be talking to Congress about it. Most people don't take the decision to cross a border and to permanently relocate themselves very lightly. They do it because they feel like it's the best choice that they have, whether it's because they're fleeing a country that's unsafe, or because they're feeling like it's the only way that they can have any hope. And so I think we have some responsibility to, as well as U.S. citizens, what is our capital doing in other countries that's driving people to feel like they have to leave home? And whether that's to come here or to go to the EU or whatever, what is it that that corporations are doing in those countries that's making people feel like that leaving home is a better case, right? Why do corporations go to other countries to, leave the US and go elsewhere? They're looking for cheaper labor sometimes. Sometimes they're looking for less significant tax burdens. Sometimes they're looking for less environmental regulations. Sometimes they're deciding to go to places that have less democracy. They're making those kinds of choices in order to, have a high profit line. And we've made it not that hard, all other things considered, for global capital to move from in and out of countries. But we have made it pretty hard for global labor to move in and out of countries, whether that's by legislation that limits the number of people that emigrate, whether it's limiting people's ability to work in one country or another, or limiting people's ability to use the training that they have in one country in another country. Like you can't take a medical education that you got in Ukraine and use it in Canada necessarily without going through a bunch of other kinds of certifications. And that all of those kinds of things are essentially creating trade policies, that are about protecting us, meaning US citizens, from other countries. I think it's time for us to start investigating how to think about protecting the global, basically the global working class from the global elite. So finally, I'm gonna talk a little bit about a concept that I touched on earlier, which is the concept of benefits portability. And, what I think Larry's talking a lot about the benefits that have come from collective bargaining as being part of what gave us some broad level of prosperity. We have historically had sort of a labor contract in this country where you get your health insurance from your employer, you get your ability to accrue paid time off and retirement security through your employer. And to some degree that's a historical relic from World War II, when companies in the United States, manufacturing companies particularly, had wage freezes imposed on them by the federal government. There was a labor supply problem because lots of men were at war. So in addition to opening up jobs to people who had historically been excluded from jobs, they decided to also compete on things like offering health insurance. And so we have this labor contract which essentially has been shredded by employers now in the 21st century to a pretty great degree. We also have a thing called the social contract, which is really about what do you do to survive when you don't have work, right? So that's more things like unemployment insurance or short-term disability for periods where you are going to have to go back, you are likely to go back to work, but you need some short-term income smoothing, or things like Social Security and Medicare, which are for when you're going to retire to make sure that you have some kind of income. All of those things are dependent generally on you having worked or having been married to somebody who paid into that system, or being the minor of a person who paid into that system. So I think that what we have to do a little bit is to start to think creatively about how we are going to collectivize some of the provision of those benefits that have historically been tied to employers. Because what we are seeing is that even for a lot of people who have a sort of 40-hour-a-week job, they don't have that kind of security anymore. And so thinking about how to move our country back into a place of broad prosperity might not be through the labor contract that we've historically had. We need a different labor contract for the 21st century, and a way of allowing us to kind of keep our health insurance even as we're changing jobs, or keep retirement security with, if you have 3 different income streams, like 3 different employers, for lack of a better word, paying into that retirement security. Last, I want to talk a little bit just to the people in the room who work in technology, because I think that, there's some also some special questions that you guys get to ask, and you folks, I should say, get to ask yourselves. So what's the thing that I can do to turn our neighborhood into a sibling hood? And I would say that's, could be figuring out a way, if you're a company that uses gig economy, gig workers, to give them some actual equity in your company that is acknowledging the sweat equity that they are putting into making your company profitable in the first place. It's not just programmers who should get equity. If Uber had set up their model where Uber drivers got a small stake in the company for being in the first year of the driving class, I think that we would be having a different conversation about that company right now. It would require them to have had a different ethos in the first place. I think you can ask yourself things like, are there ways for me to program my ratings algorithm so that it takes into account the fact that my customers have racial and gender bias? Whether or not they will admit it, they have it. And sometimes they rate people in different ways because they look differently, and that you are able to use that ratings algorithm to, in some ways, identify and discount that kind of prejudice. And then last, I think, there's also options about how you might structure your firm, like making it a worker-owned co-op that's democratically run. In closing, I'm just going to go back to one last line from the King's Speech, which is this. It's all right to tell a man to lift himself by his bootstraps, but it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his bootstraps. And I think that whether or not everybody's boots in the future are going to be stitched by robots or stitched by humans, we have a responsibility to make sure that everyone has boots.
Good afternoon. My name is Nadia Hub. I'm an attorney at Community Legal Services. I'm here to bring the house down. I represent low-wage workers in Philadelphia, and I'm here to give you a little bit of the boring lawyer perspective on everything that we talked about today. And I guess I'm pessimistic because I know that I agree with Katie and with Larry that the issue here is inequality and the lack of worker power. The kinds of workers that are being affected by automation at the moment, particularly in Philadelphia, low-wage workers mostly work in the service economy. Those service economy jobs are difficult to unionize. I think that we're going to have to turn to our legislators and policymakers to come up with solutions. However, I don't think our legislators have ever sufficiently dealt with the fact that there are human beings in the workplace, that there are women in the workplace, that there are parents, that there are LGBT folks in the workplace. We don't even have anti-discrimination protection in Pennsylvania for LGBT folks. So I'm a little pessimistic that this bigger problem, maybe it's going to be a bigger problem in 10 years or 30 years. But the problem coming down the pike scares me because I know what we haven't been able to move in Pennsylvania. And in a minute I'll talk about even when we can get stuff done in Philly, then it comes under threat. So I think I should use this one first. I should bring my reading glasses. So, this is my slide from the beginning. So my point to you today, one of my points is going to be that we should be treating workers like humans, not like robots. And there's something is lacking in our workplaces now, and particularly in low-wage workplaces where my clients don't have paid sick leave, they don't have paid family leave. Both parents in a household are working, so there's no one to take care of a kid. Therefore, you need affordable child care. You need paid family leave to be able to take care of an elderly parent who gets sick or someone else in the family who gets sick. All these kinds of proposals have been lingering in Harrisburg for years, and that's why I'm a little bit pessimistic. Paid sick leave, our minimum wage is the lowest of all the surrounding states. We're still at $7.25 an hour in Pennsylvania. And then some things that have happened recently that are positive in the area, where City Council has made some changes, like for instance, paid sick leave for Philadelphia residents, Harrisburg is threatening to preempt those kinds of laws on the local level. So where we do have some energy right now to do progressive worker-friendly policies, they're getting stymied. The City Council just recently passed a bill to require, to prohibit employers from asking for wage histories. And why that's important is because if you were discriminated in the past because of your race or because of your gender, then allowing that salary history to then play a part in the new employer setting the salary just perpetuates the discrimination. So that is also being preempted by Harrisburg. It's also in court, but Comcast is suing over that one too. But those are the kinds of things where I think that that from the baseline, although I'm hopeful about certain things, I think ultimately we will get there. Right now, it's not looking so great in Pennsylvania. But just thinking generally beyond the kind of human needs that people have right now that we aren't quite addressing on the job, thinking in particular about the topic of today, which I guess that's why I was even asked to come up onto this dais. There are some things that are affecting workers right now that you could say are about automation or algorithms. One policy proposal that's floating around has to do with fair scheduling. So let me explain what's going on. You might have heard about in retail and in manufacturing, they're doing something that's algorithm-based about just-in-time manufacturing, where you only get as many supplies as you need, you go by season, you go by what the sales reports suggest as selling, and so you start focusing on that in your manufacturing. Well, they're doing the same thing with scheduling. So in like the H&M down the street, or at another retail store, or at a probably supermarkets perhaps, are using algorithms to figure out what is the most efficient way to schedule my workers. And that's data that they get just in time, which means that they're not necessarily telling the workers in advance what their schedules are going to be. That causes huge disruptions. If you're working at a grocery store and going to college at night, you have daycare to set up that you can't work a night shift, you have to work a day shift. Or you go all the way to work to find out, oh, you're not on the schedule today, right? So it used to be that when, I don't know who here has waitress, you would just know your schedule. You're working in a little restaurant, you just knew when you were expected, you could build your schedule around it, you could pick your classes when you're going to Temple to finish your college degree, built around that schedule. But that's kind of all up in the air right now with this kind of algorithm-based scheduling. It's causing huge disruptions, in particular to the low-wage jobs that our clients have. So there are policy solutions there that would require advanced time, advanced notice of changes in schedule, an ability to accept or reject that new schedule. There are things that are being proposed. New York has a great retail action project, is working a lot on fair scheduling. There's also some proposals that are floating around our city council to do the same thing. And it really is something that it affects daycares too. Daycares want the parents to have set schedules because it makes their lives more manageable in terms of knowing that the parent's going to be able to come and pick up the kid if their second and third option can't make it that day to pick up the kid, right? Can't make it to an appointment if you can't get that time off. So there are certain things that are being discussed in terms of fair scheduling and the real disruptions that really impact low-wage workers. And low-wage workers in Philadelphia tend to be minorities, tend to be women in these kinds of jobs. And so that's why you have to think about childcare issues and school meetings and all the other kinds of things that parents or single moms have to take care of. The other kind of algorithm that I think I just want to put out there, I don't have necessarily a solution for it, but there are hiring algorithms that are being used more and more by employers. I found a little article on SHRM's website, it's the Society of Human Resource Managers, talking about how algorithms can help you make a more efficient and better workforce, right? So they're promoting these kinds of hiring algorithms as well that can, they say that it can take the bias out of the decision making if you have algorithms looking and scanning resumes and looking for certain kinds of experience. But the problem is that if it's not designed correctly, there could be biases built into the system. the fact that an employer is using an algorithm may then also be a defense for them, like, oh, well, we didn't discriminate against this person, we used an algorithm to do this. And it's very difficult to show that an algorithm is discriminatory unless it's really clear that they were looking for something in particular, because our employment laws haven't caught up to these new technologies, the way that technology is used. Our employment laws presuppose a hiring person that's making a decision, right? And so pointing out these are just things that we need to be aware of and think about. It's compounded, I think, a little bit about the kinds of big data things that are also happening at the same time as algorithms and automation are happening. So if you think about the hiring algorithm in the context of living in an era where there's all this data that exists out there that can be purchased by anyone, think about the stories about how Target can figure out by your purchase of certain vitamins the fact that maybe someone in your household is pregnant. So if you think about that kind of data being potentially available, there's all kinds of possibilities there for other forms of discrimination playing a role in hiring as well. So, an employer could, if we don't figure out ways to protect that information, they could get information not just about your social media postings if they're hiring you, but other information about your purchasing, figuring out your race in advance, just something that you might not put on your resume, information about your purchasing history or genetic information or health history information that could be gleaned from your purchasing history. So those are the kinds of things that I don't necessarily have a solution for, but I can tell you that our employment laws aren't really set up to deal with those right now. The thing these are all just kind of the thoughts of an employment lawyer when thinking about all the different ways that these things kind of come together. One of the things that we think about, if there's going to be displacement, when there's displacement because of trade, displacement because of NAFTA, it's a little bit more visible if you can see that a workplace shut down, a factory shut down because of trade, a factory shut down because of some sort of NAFTA situation. And so there are programs in place to help workers affected by that kind of shift. We don't have the same kind of ability to identify workers that are affected by technological change, so there's not going to be the same ability to target folks with the kind of workforce development programs that we currently have. So there's not going to be a WARN Act. WARN Act is like the plant closing law. There's not going to be something like that available that I can think of that would work for technological change when it happens. A couple other ideas for you is that Katie already talked a little bit about portable benefits and the universal basic income. That's an idea that people have, that if there's going to be all these shifts and you're not going to be getting benefits through your employer anymore, maybe it's time to think about the safety net in a different way. As tattered as it is, maybe worth rethinking the whole thing and creating something like a universal basic income so everyone's entitled to a certain basic level of income, and then we can take it from there in terms of what people want to do beyond that. And then finally, I want to talk about, right now, we have, huge amounts of poverty in Philadelphia and people unable to get good jobs. One of the things that we're already working on in Philadelphia is trying to remove barriers that prevent people from getting that first job or that good job. So, things that we're already working on and we're hoping to expand, things like expungement of criminal records and pardons. We're working on an initiative called Clean Slate in Pennsylvania. It's already been introduced. SB 1197 and HB 1984 would automate expungement. It would actually seal records after a certain amount of time passes so people don't have to find a lawyer and figure out a way to pay for an expungement and go through that process. It would just happen. So there's a good use of technology. And other things that are barriers are things like disabilities and other kinds of records that are out there on databases that you might not want people to see. So these are some of the things that we're working on in terms of getting people more employable. The question of being resilient and flexible going forward and learning new skills as we go forward, I think that's what what Larry was talking about is that everyone's talking about it being a workforce education and training issue, or even public education issue beyond that, going before that. But I just wanted to throw a couple of those ideas out there in terms of the kinds of things that we're going to be seeing, and the challenges that we're all going to face in particular in moving our elected officials to do the right thing about it.
Okay. We're going to do a quick Q&A with what time we have left here, so if everybody could just jump up. Awesome. All right. So I want to kind of address what I thought at least was or is the elephant in the room. Larry, you said the discussion.
Not an elephant. I swear.
Larry, you said the discussion of robots is a distraction from three main issues, those being job erosion, wage stagnation, and inequality. Katie, you seem to agree that those aren't issues. Larry, you said the idea that technology has created joblessness in the past, or that technology will create joblessness in the future, is totally unwarranted. Katie, you pointed out that you actually pointed out a bevy of jobs that have been replaced by robots and automation, and called it a slow erosion of the prosperity of American workers. Nadia, what's at the core of their disagreement?
Why don't we let them answer that?
Sure. Or do you agree? What? It seemed like there was some disagreement there on a couple of different, basically, the whole thing.
I mean, I would say, I think that Larry and I have a basic agreement that the fundamental problem is a lack of worker power. And that one of the things that is causing massive inequality, I mean, the primary thing that is causing massive inequality is, a lack of worker power and that is, kind of and corporate greed, taking advantage of that lack of worker power to like rake in a bunch of profits for themselves and not share the spoils, if you will. I mean, I think that where we differ is in the response to, where do we see the future going? And, to some degree, I think that might be generational, and it might also be a question of the fact that, I have historically worked with a population that has primarily been excluded from even the best moments in the American economy, and that is not the case for every person that has worked in labor economics necessarily. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I mean, the steelworkers generally tended to be white guys who were working in like 40-hour-a-week jobs, and they organized to make those jobs better, right? Like they were not.
Actually, you're quite mistaken. When manufacturing started getting deindustrialized, it was at the moment where black workers actually had a large piece of manufacturing. They were the ones disproportionately hurt by deindustrialization. I don't think we have many disagreements about policy. I think it's about whether technological change is really what it's all about. I mean, the fact that we have high poverty in this country has very little to do with. I agree with you about a lot of things you described. I didn't see you connect that to actually technological change or automation. Okay, I helped develop a bill that was introduced last week to raise the minimum wage to $15 nationally. That would increase wages for 30% of the workforce, disproportionately women, disproportionately minority. The minimum wage right now is 25% below when Martin Luther King gave that speech, even though the productivity of the country actually doubled. Now that is just pure policy. It has nothing to do with technological change. We're talking about a third of the workforce having substantially lower wages just because of inaction, because people with power don't let change happen. That helps workers.
So how do we, for policy, how do we pass legislation that, as Michelle said, there's good parts of automation, there's bad parts of automation? How do we pass legislation that enables the good parts of legislation while stymieing the bad parts? So, for instance, let me break this down. So, Bill Gates recently proposed a robot tax on companies. That would be a tax on companies that use robots that replace workers. Is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing? How do we get the best of both worlds, Michelle?
So I think you can. Two things come to mind that I think was kind of that maybe because I work in the thinking about the future and how robots can bridge gaps that I see a lot of evidence for. Is I think about what's happening in terms of the use of cell phones and the net neutrality and the connectivity of people. So the average person in poverty might, I would say, I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but the majority of people have access to a cell phone and have access to a smartphone, therefore have access to information that they didn't have access to before. So in one sense, the technology and the automation have become an opportunity to give people access. Policy, though, needs to be able to allow so that now that information is through the network and having internet access is a part of the main loop, is to make that now a right, just like water rights or electricity, and make sure that people who don't have the money to buy cable and the internet still have access and still are able to use their mobile phones to access information and to learn, etc. I think that's an example of where the automation and Google's machine learning algorithm is available to everyone. If you're using Google, you're using machine learning algorithms. And so therefore, if the average low-wage worker is now able to look for a job using their mobile phone, to me that's an advance that we're missing. So this is to me the tension is, we're creating jobs, but we're also creating access, I think, to people to be connected to the global space. And I think of what's happening, for example, there's an article that talks about how do people who are in poverty access information, the internet. Most of it is through the phones. And that's huge. That's huge, and to me, that's a leveler as well. And so I guess I think the policy then comes in making sure that that if this is the way that you access information, that we make sure that that you have access to that and that you're able to afford it and that it becomes a right and that getting access to the internet is not a privilege, but something that you give to everyone.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, to make more clear a point that I was sort of touched on about the collectivization of knowledge. It wasn't Uber creating a platform that disrupted the taxi industry. It was the advent of the global positioning system and the ability to use it with a smartphone, right? 20 years ago, you would not get in a car with a total stranger in a city that was totally foreign to you and expect that you could tell that person to take you anywhere in that town and that they would know where it was. Taxi drivers had knowledge of how to get around a city. That was part of what you paid them for. In fact, in London, there was actually a test that you had to pass that was called the knowledge. And until you passed the knowledge, you couldn't be a taxi worker in London. And I think that, and Uber had a huge fight with whatever the taxi commission is called in London about their drivers, not needing to pass this because of GPS. So the question is, if we have collectivized sort of the world's knowledge of taxi cab drivers, being that they knew how to get around in places, is there any benefit to the taxi driver now from that knowledge now being in the hands of every person who has a smartphone and a car that's able to be certified by Uber or Lyft?
So going beyond access, right? Let's say I'm a native speaker of Arabic trying to learn English, and someone hands me an English dictionary, doesn't mean I'm going to learn how to speak the language. What is the current state of workers gaining those technical skills to be able to use these tools?
I think about kind of being able to use the phone. And, and I think there has to be opportunities to kind of use the tool. And I think those are available in community-based settings as well. This is an anecdote. I was looking at I live in Mount Airy, and they had a Mount Airy community, access to like easy classes. And one of the classes was learn how to program your phone, And I think of that, I'm like, oh, someone's taking that class, but that's actually, it was for $30 to try to learn how to become more savvy with your smartphone. But those little things, and I think is important. I also was reading a recent article about coal miners that were displaced because coal, being able to mine for coal was not as popular. So someone started a software class where they're reteaching them how to code. Turns out that coal miners turns out to be great programmers because they're detail-oriented people. And so they actually make great software and they become good programmers. So my point is, it's maybe on all of us collectively to begin to figure out how to teach people who don't have access to provide the opportunity for them to retool. And I don't know if we're going to be able to wait on the government to make policy to do that, but I think as community, it has to be a community endeavor to make sure that we don't leave behind those that maybe it's a little bit difficult to come up to speed on the technology. But I believe that that we as a community can begin to make sure everyone's included in understanding and moving forward. There's a group that started where young people are helping elderly people to be able to Skype. And we think of that as a trivial thing, but now they're able to use the technology to keep in touch with their loved ones So that to me is an example of where maybe as a community we need to take responsibility for making sure no one gets left behind.
Sure.
Can I say something about Uber? So Katie, you and I had a long sit at a bar and talk over a lot of these things. Because I don't actually, that we're talking past each other. The technology of GPS being responsible for the disruption of taxis is not actually about the replacement of maybe a little bit of human knowledge for machine knowledge for humans. But what has disrupted the taxi industry is several decades where taxis themselves converted from employees to independent contractors and dispatch. Has nothing to do with technology, has to do with their power. And what's going on with Uber right now is one giant misclassification scheme. And they had no special technology. When they pulled out of Austin, within 2 or 3 weeks, Austin was pretty well satisfied by new entry. They have only the benefit of being there first, and the fact that they are a huge, giant bully. And what I've learned from that misclassification is that we can't really fix it through suits. This is what, what's the name of the woman who's suing Uber from? Her. She sued FedEx. FedEx drivers are independent contractors. They have lost many suits and paid hundreds of millions of dollars to in fines. But every time they do that, they just change their way of doing business a little bit, and the people remain independent contractors and totally screwed over. That change has to do with legal innovation, not technological innovation. The whole shift to subcontracted work, the alternative work arrangements that your organization works very hard at, has nothing to do with technological change, and everything to do with legal innovation. I don't think legal innovation is technological innovation. I think it's a bunch of corporate lawyers, well-paid, who can outmaneuver everybody else, and we ought to find ways to end those practices.
Let's do one question from the audience. Sorry, we're going to leave it to one. Let's see a hand in the back.
Hi, I wanted to, you mentioned the lawsuits. Why don't you go after Silicon Valley, all of those companies that say that they are going to hire more people? Facebook is a perfect example. because of that incident that happened with the gentleman, the elderly gentleman that happened on Easter Sunday,
Oh, that got killed?
that was
On
killed,
Facebook
and he
Live?
put it on Facebook. Now all of a sudden, it's like a crisis has to happen before. Now they're saying, oh, well, we're going to hire 3,000 employees. They didn't say they're going to hire them in this country. They just said that they're going to hire 3,000 employees to basically monitor Facebook, people's Facebook pages to see if they can catch, I guess, people that are doing those types of videos that are, you know, and if somebody is suicidal or somebody does something to someone else, that's what they're going to do to offset the problem.
So the question is, how do we make sure that these new jobs that are being created stay in America?
Stay here,
And actually have it.
Yeah.
because they can hire a whole bunch of people from India.
Let's get some answers, folks.
You
What's going
know?
on?
They're not hiring the people right here.
Well, you know, I think one of the reasons why we hear so much about robots is that tech people think they're the center of the universe. And everything they're doing and creating is creating the future, and it's all about them. And in fact, it may not be. And when they are very powerful people, the tech companies are the ones most responsible for parking their profits offshore, cheating us out of our taxes.
Right.
They
So
are
who's
the
there to
ones
help?
pushing guest worker visa programs that Tom right here talked about. But
Different kind, but
different,
yes.
a higher wage,
Yeah.
but indentured servants, H-1Bs. And they are the ones telling us that not only should we have more H-1Bs who are indentured servants to tech companies, but that everybody who graduates, every foreign student who comes to America should be able to get a degree and therefore get a green card and become an indentured servant. Well, actually, they're not an indentured servant, but they get the jobs. And at the same time, we know that Silicon Valley has been reports on who's hired in terms of women and American minorities, and we are never going to solve that problem if we always allow them a assured supply of low-wage workers from abroad. So I'm not necessarily, speaking ill of people that are from another country. I sort of think that everybody ought to have full worker rights, and we ought to allow people to come into the country to work, depending upon the economic conditions of the industry. But the idea that these companies can't find people in the United States
Right, that's the
is absolutely
excuse.
wrong.
Exactly.
Absolutely wrong.
Exactly.
So we'll take one more quick question. Go ahead.
I love technology, the better, we're behind, so the more the better. However, there seems to be a gap where technology comes in and that worker leaves out. And so I hear you when you're saying, oh yeah, we'll go get more jobs and jobs will be more creative, but that person now has been out of work 10 months, 11 months, who's already working, making a $5 wage. Now they're even behind the 8 ball and further while you're looking for a new job, and you're thinking of a job. But that's where I don't understand, or a policy or condition or something needs to be put in place for that. Does that make sense?
And so, right, and if you can get unemployment benefits for a few months, but that's not gonna solve the problem if the jobs are changing.
No, it's not.
And so the kinds of systems that we have in place already aren't working that well, even if you don't look at the technological change. If you're just looking at someone who's out of work and needs new skills, our systems are not great at addressing that. So I agree with you that we need to have a better solution in terms of having much more workforce training available and paid for by employers, by government. Those are the kinds of things that have stayed flat or gone down in recent years. In this moment of, they call it austerity, right? When the recession hit, spending by the government also went down when we actually needed to have more programs in place. So one of the things we've talked about for people who are hard to employ might be a public jobs program. So for people who can't get a job because of a disability or a criminal record, for instance, people with criminal records also need to work and provide for their families. So one of the things that we can think about are public jobs programs that might assist people that are displaced by whatever they were displaced by. So that would be one idea. I don't know if anyone else has ideas.
Yeah, which we actually won one of in the city of Philadelphia during, the implementation of welfare reform.
Back in 96, 97.
There was a city, created jobs program called the Transitional Work Corporation that helped people find jobs. And that program had tons of problems, don't get me wrong. It wasn't like a perfect solution, but at least it did attempt to address the employment challenges of folks who were really had some significant barriers to, holding down a 40-hour-a-week job. I think personally that we ought to re-examine our idea about whether the 40-hour-a-week job should be the gold standard for employment in the future.
No, it shouldn't
I
be.
think that that's a pretty fair question for us to ask. There are lots of people, like I'm a single mom, I don't work a strict 9-to-5 schedule of going to the same place every day, and I couldn't have the career that I had if I didn't have some kind of flexibility where occasionally I can take time off in the middle of the day to take one of my kids to the dentist. I spent, my daughter's graduating from high school this year, and I've spent a bunch of time doing stuff because having a senior in high school is sort of like having a kid in kindergarten again for the amount of time that you spend at school. And I think that we ought to recognize the fact that the 40-hour-a-week model, while it is good for some people, isn't good for everyone, and we should build system supports for people who, for a variety of different reasons, can't do that.
Beautiful. Beautiful. All right, thank you very much to our wonderful panelists. Very gracious host here at Schneider. And also, one quick thing, please stay. There's a reception out in the lobby. There's food and drink out there. It's for your consumption. Apparently it's delicious.
Follow her.
Awesome, thank you.
I'm there.